In September of 1903, a letter arrived at a cramped apartment in Bern, Switzerland. The man who received it was not yet famous. He was 24 years old, working 6 days a week at a patent office, reviewing other people's inventions while his own ideas burned inside his mind. His name was Albert Einstein. The woman beside him, his wife of 8 months, watched as he tore open the envelope, and the letter in his hands contained news about an 18-month-old girl neither of them had held in nearly a year. She was their firstborn daughter, born in secret, hidden from the world, raised by grandparents in a distant country. The letter mentioned scarlet fever. It mentioned complications. What it said next we may never know, because every letter after this one was destroyed, deliberately, completely, as if the child had never existed at all. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic world. Einstein, the humanitarian. Einstein, the gentle sage with wild hair and kind eyes. Einstein, the man who spoke of compassion and human dignity. This man had fathered a daughter and erased her from history. What happened to Lieserl? The question has haunted researchers for nearly 4 decades. Some believe she died from scarlet fever, as the letters suggest. Others think she was given up for adoption, raised by a Serbian family under a different name. A few researchers have proposed darker theories, that she was born with disabilities and placed in an institution, that she survived into adulthood but was never acknowledged, that records were deliberately destroyed to protect Einstein's rising reputation. The truth remains buried, but the mystery of Lieserl is only the beginning of this story. To understand how a father could erase his own child, we must go back 7 years, to a physics classroom in Zurich, and the woman who would sacrifice everything for him. The year was 1896. The place was the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, one of the few institutions in Europe that admitted women to study science. On a September morning, a 17-year-old German student walked into a physics lecture and noticed something unusual. There was a woman in the room. Her name was Milva Maric. She was 20 years old, Serbian by birth, Orthodox Christian by faith, and she walked with a noticeable limp, the result of a congenital hip condition that had marked her as different since childhood. She was also extraordinary by any measure. Milva was one of only 5 women in all of Europe studying physics at the university level. She had fought her way through a Serbian village school, a Zagreb gymnasium, and the rigid barriers that kept women out of higher education. She had arrived in Zurich alone, determined, and remarkably talented. The young man could not stop staring at her. Albert Einstein was everything Milva was not, confident to the point of arrogance, charming when he wanted to be, and utterly unconcerned with rules or conventions. He had already been expelled from a German gymnasium for his rebellious attitude. He had renounced his German citizenship at 16 to avoid military service. He had failed his first entrance exam to the Polytechnic and spent a year at a Swiss preparatory school before gaining admission. His professors found him irritating. His classmates found him strange. But his mind was something else entirely. Milva saw it immediately. Behind the cockiness and the careless dress, behind the jokes and the dismissive attitude toward authority, there was a fierce intelligence that matched her own. They began studying together. They debated physics late into the night. They challenged each other, pushed each other, fell in love with each other's minds before they fell in love with each other. "We understand each other's dark souls," Albert wrote to her in one of his early letters. It was a strange phrase for a love letter, dark souls, but it captured something true about their connection. They were both outsiders, both rebels, both convinced that the universe held secrets waiting to be unlocked, and that they might be the ones to unlock them. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems. Milva was Serbian. Albert's family was German-Jewish. She was Orthodox Christian. He was, at best, indifferent to religion. She was older than him by nearly 4 years. She walked with a limp. And in the rigid social hierarchy of turn-of-the-century Europe, none of these things were acceptable. Albert's mother, Pauline Einstein, made her feelings clear from the first moment she learned of the relationship. "She is a book like you," Pauline told her son, her voice dripping with contempt. "But you ought to have a wife." The implication was unmistakable. Milva might be intelligent, but intelligence was not what a wife required. A wife should be pretty, domestic, socially appropriate. Milva was none of these things. "That woman limps, Albert," Pauline continued. "She is older, she is Serbian. What will people say?" Albert's response was defiant. "They will say nothing, mother, because they will be too busy reading our published papers." It was a bold statement. It was also prophetic in ways he did not intend. But the word "our" would prove more complicated than either of them imagined. The courtship continued despite family opposition. Albert and Milva studied together, dreamed together, planned a future together. In their letters they spoke of our work and our theory, a shared intellectual enterprise that would revolutionize physics. Milva's mathematical skills were in some areas superior to Albert's. She helped him with calculations. She challenged his assumptions. She was not merely his girlfriend, she was his collaborator. But the world was not ready for a woman physicist, and the world was certainly not ready for an unmarried woman who became pregnant. By the spring of 1901, Milva knew she was carrying Albert's child. The timing could not have been worse. She was preparing for her final examinations at the Polytechnic, exams that would determine whether she received her degree and could pursue a career in physics. Albert was desperately seeking employment, rejected by one university after another, unable to secure even a lowly assistant position. They had no money, they had no prospects, and now they had a secret that could destroy them both. In that era, an unmarried pregnancy was not merely a social embarrassment. It was a catastrophe. For a woman, it meant permanent disgrace. For a man with academic ambitions, it meant the end of any hope for a respectable career. Universities did not hire men who fathered illegitimate children. Scientific societies did not welcome them. The doors that Albert needed to open would slam shut forever. They made a decision. Milva would return to her family in Serbia to give birth. The pregnancy would be hidden. The child would be dealt with somehow. They did not discuss the details in their surviving letters, or if they did, those letters were later destroyed. What we know is this. Milva traveled to Novi Sad in the winter of 1901, heavily pregnant, alone, while Albert remained in Switzerland. He did not go with her. He did not visit. He had a job interview. He had applications to complete. He had his career to consider. In January of 1902, in her parents' home in Serbia, Milva Marek gave birth to a daughter. She named the child Lieserl, a diminutive form of Elizabeth. Albert learned of the birth by letter. His response, preserved in the correspondence discovered decades later, reveals a man who viewed fatherhood as an intellectual curiosity rather than an emotional reality. "Is the child healthy?" He wrote. "How does she cry? I would like to make a Lieserl myself sometime. It must be very interesting." As if the child were an experiment. As if fatherhood were a phenomenon to be observed rather than experienced. As if his daughter were a curiosity rather than a human being who shared his blood. He never saw her, not once, not ever. But here is where the timeline becomes crucial, and where the tragedy deepens. In January of 1903, while Lieserl was still alive and living with Milva's parents in Serbia, Albert and Milva married in a small civil ceremony in Bern. No family members attended. They began their life together as husband and wife, while their daughter remained hidden away, a secret that could not be acknowledged. The months passed. Albert worked at the patent office, a position he had finally secured through the help of a friend's father. He wrote letters asking about Lieserl's health, her development, her temperament. But he did not travel to see her. He did not send money for her care. He did not make plans to bring her to Switzerland, to unite the family that he had created. Then, in September of 1903, 8 months after the wedding, the letters stopped mentioning Lieserl entirely. The child was approximately 18 months old. The last reference to her spoke of scarlet fever, a disease that killed thousands of children every year in that era, before antibiotics, before modern medicine. Did Lieserl die? Was she given up for adoption? Was she placed in an institution? The historical record falls silent. The family never spoke of her again. Albert Einstein, who would become the most famous scientist in human history, never mentioned his firstborn child in any public statement, any interview, any memoir. She simply vanished. Some researchers believe Lieserl died from the scarlet fever mentioned in the letters. This is the most widely accepted theory, supported by biographers like Walter Isaacson. Others have searched Serbian records for evidence of adoption, finding tantalizing hints but no definitive proof. A few have suggested that Lieserl was born with developmental disabilities, perhaps related to the scarlet fever, perhaps present from birth, and was placed in an institution where she lived out her days in anonymity. The truth may never be known. What we do know is this: Albert and Milva were already married when their daughter disappeared from history. They were husband and wife, bound by law and ceremony, yet they allowed their child to vanish without apparent protest. They had another child, Hans Albert, in May of 1904, less than a year after Lieserl's disappearance. They built a life that did not include the daughter they had hidden. They never spoke of her again. Whatever happened to Lieserl, one thing is certain. The man who would unlock the secrets of the cosmos kept one secret so dark that it remained hidden for 8 decades. And the woman who bore that secret, who gave birth alone, who left her child with her parents, who returned to Switzerland to be a wife while her daughter faded from existence, would spend the rest of her life in his shadow, watching her contributions erased, her sacrifices forgotten, her talents diminished. But to understand what kind of man Albert Einstein was becoming, we must turn to the year that changed everything, the year that made him immortal. 1905. Historians would later call it the annus mirabilis, the miracle year. In the span of 12 months, a 26-year-old patent clerk would publish 4 papers that would fundamentally reshape humanity's understanding of the universe. It was the most productive year in the history of physics, perhaps in the history of science itself. The setting was modest: a cramped apartment in Bern, a small kitchen where Milva prepared meals, a bedroom where their infant son, Hans Albert, slept in a wooden cradle, a desk covered with papers, calculations, diagrams, and a man who worked through the night while his wife tended to their child, who scribbled equations by lamplight while the world slept, who saw things that no human being had ever seen before. The first paper, published in March, explained the photoelectric effect, the phenomenon by which light striking a metal surface causes electrons to be emitted. This paper would eventually win the Nobel Prize. The second paper, published in May, provided mathematical proof of the existence of atoms by analyzing the random motion of particles suspended in liquid, what scientists call Brownian motion. The third paper, published in June, introduced the special theory of relativity, overturning 3 centuries of Newtonian physics and revealing that space and time were not absolute but relative, dependent on the motion of the observer. The fourth paper, published in September, contained the most famous equation in history: E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Matter and energy were the same thing, interchangeable, convertible. The atomic age was born. 4 papers, 12 months, 1 man. Or was it 1 man? The question of Milva's contribution to Einstein's work remains one of the most contentious debates in the history of science. The evidence is fragmentary, suggestive, ultimately inconclusive, but it deserves examination. In his letters from this period, Albert repeatedly referred to our work and our theory. He wrote to Milva about our investigation and our paper on relative motion. He told a colleague, "I need my wife. She solves all my mathematical problems." Some historians claim that early manuscripts of certain papers were signed Einstein-Marek, though these manuscripts have never been found and the claim rests on second-hand accounts. What is certain is this: Milva was a trained physicist. She had studied the same subjects as Albert, attended the same lectures, read the same books. Her mathematical abilities were, by some accounts, superior to his. She had sacrificed her own academic career, failing her final examinations twice, once while pregnant with Lieserl and once while caring for infant Hans Albert to support his work. She had given up everything. Was she a co-author of relativity? The mainstream scientific consensus says no. The evidence is too thin, the claims too speculative. But even if she did not write the equations herself, she was undeniably part of the intellectual environment that produced them. She was the sounding board, the critic, the supporter, the partner. And when the fame came, when the world began to worship Albert Einstein as a singular genius, she was erased, just like their daughter. His colleague Michel Bessot once asked him, perhaps her name should appear on the paper. Albert paused, then he said, "The world is not ready for that." The world was not ready, and so Milva Maric became a footnote, a curiosity, a subject for feminist scholars to debate decades later. The woman who may have helped reshape physics became the woman who cooked Albert Einstein's meals and washed his clothes and raised his children while he changed the universe. In 1905, Albert Einstein gave the world new eyes to see reality. But in that same year, something shifted in his marriage. The partnership was becoming a hierarchy. The collaboration was becoming servitude. And Milva was no longer an equal if she ever had been. The years that followed brought fame but not happiness. Albert's reputation grew. Universities that had rejected him now competed for his attention. Scientific societies that had ignored him now celebrated his achievements. He moved from the patent office to a professorship in Zurich, then to Prague, then to a prestigious position in Berlin. With each step upward, Milva fell further behind. She had given up her career for him. She had borne his children, Hans Albert in 1904, Eduard in 1910. She had managed the household, handled the correspondence, created the domestic stability that allowed him to work, and in return he grew distant, cold, cruel. His letters from this period reveal a man who viewed his wife with increasing contempt. He described her as abnormal. He called her requests nonsense. He dismissed her concerns with brutal efficiency. The passionate young lover who had written about understanding her dark soul had become a stranger who could barely tolerate her presence. "You speak to me like I am your housekeeper," Milva said to him during one of their arguments. "I treat my wife as an employee I cannot fire," Albert replied. "That is an honest description." An employee he could not fire. This was how one of history's greatest minds described his marriage. This was how he spoke to the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. But if Albert could not fire his wife, he could find other ways to escape her. By 1912, he had found the perfect escape. Her name was Elsa Lurwenthal. She was his first cousin, and she was everything Milva was not. Elsa Lurwenthal was divorced, maternal, uncomplicated. She did not challenge Albert intellectually. She did not debate physics with him or question his theories. She admired him. She adored him. She wanted nothing more than to take care of him, to manage his life, to bask in his growing fame. Where Milva was dark and intense, Elsa was light and simple. Where Milva demanded to be treated as an equal, Elsa was content to serve. The affair began in Berlin in 1912. Where Albert traveled frequently for scientific conferences. He wrote Elsa passionate letters while still sharing a bed with Milva. He described his wife as the darkest shadow of my life, while telling his cousin that she was his salvation. He maintained two completely separate emotional realities, compartmentalizing his existence with a precision that would have impressed his fellow physicists. "I treat my wife as an employee whom I cannot fire," he wrote to Elsa in 1913. "I have my own bedroom and avoid being alone with her." The same month he wrote to Milva, "I am looking forward to our move to Berlin. The children will enjoy it." The move to Berlin. This was Albert's masterstroke of cruelty. In 1914, he accepted a prestigious position at the Prussian Academy of Sciences, the most honored scientific institution in Germany. The position required him to live in Berlin. and Berlin, of course, was where Elsa lived. He convinced Milva to uproot their family and move to the city where his mistress waited. He installed his wife and children in an apartment while conducting his affair openly. He forced Milva to exist in the same city as the woman who was replacing her, to attend the same social functions, to smile and pretend that everything was normal. Then, in July of 1914, Albert presented Milva with a document that would shock historians when it was discovered decades later. It was a contract, a set of written conditions she must accept if she wished to remain his wife. The conditions were brutal in their specificity. You will make sure that my clothes and laundry are kept in good order. You will deliver meals to my room 3 times a day. You will keep my bedroom and study tidy. You will renounce all personal relations with me insofar as they are not completely necessary for social reasons. You will stop talking to me if I request it. You will leave my bedroom or study immediately without protest if I request it. You will expect no intimacy from me whatsoever. You will not reproach me in any way. You will not belittle me in front of our children. This was not a marriage. This was a prison sentence. The man who would become a symbol of human compassion and dignity had reduced his wife to the status of a servant, less than a servant because a servant could quit. Milva was trapped. She had no career. She had no money of her own. She had 2 children who needed stability, and she had a husband who had made clear that her only value was as a housekeeper who must never speak unless spoken to. "This is not a marriage," Milva said when she read the document. "This is imprisonment." "No," Albert replied. "A prison has no exit. You are free to leave at any time. These are simply the conditions if you wish to stay." Free to leave. As if a woman in 1914, with no income, no profession, and 2 young children, could simply walk away. As if freedom were a matter of choice rather than circumstance. Milva signed the contract. She tried to live by its rules. She lasted 3 weeks. On July 29, 1914, Milva and the children boarded a train back to Zurich. Albert accompanied them to the station. Witnesses reported that he wept as the train pulled away, that he stood on the platform with tears streaming down his face, watching his family disappear. But his letters tell a different story. That same week, he wrote to Elsa expressing relief and freedom. The tears were real. The relief was also real. Albert Einstein was a man of contradictions, capable of genuine emotion and genuine cruelty in the same moment, weeping for his children while celebrating his escape from their mother. Milva collapsed upon returning to Zurich. The stress of the journey, the humiliation of the contract, the destruction of her marriage, it overwhelmed her physically and psychologically. She took to her bed for weeks. The children, Hans Albert and Eduard, were left to wonder what had happened to their family. Hans Albert was 10 years old. He was old enough to understand that something terrible had occurred, old enough to sense the betrayal even if he could not name it. He would carry the wound for the rest of his life. Eduard was 4. He was too young to understand, but not too young to feel. The absence of his father would shape him in ways that no one could predict, ways that would lead, eventually, to tragedy. The divorce would not come until 1919. 5 years of legal battles, financial negotiations, bitter correspondence. Milva demanded security for herself and the children. Albert resisted, complained, accused her of greed. Finally, they reached an agreement that would become one of the strangest footnotes in scientific history. Albert offered Milva the money from the Nobel Prize. He had not yet won the Nobel Prize. He would not win it for another 2 years, but he was so confident that he promised her the prize money as part of the divorce settlement. In 1921, Albert Einstein received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on the photoelectric effect. The prize money, approximately 121,000 Swedish kroner, went to Milva, as promised. She used it to buy apartment buildings in Zurich, hoping to secure her financial future and provide for the children. But why would Albert offer such a large sum? Why give away a fortune to a woman he had treated so poorly? Some historians believe it was guilt, payment for the years of cruelty, compensation for the career she had sacrificed. Others suggest it was acknowledgement of her contributions to his work, a tacit admission that she deserved credit for the theories that had made him famous. We cannot know for certain. What we do know is this: Milva got the money, Albert got his freedom, and the pattern of his behavior was already set. In June of 1919, just weeks after the divorce was finalized, Albert married Elsa Lerwenthal in a quiet ceremony in Berlin. The bride was 43 years old, divorced, the mother of 2 adult daughters. The groom was 40, the most famous scientist in Europe, about to become the most famous scientist in the world. They had known each other since childhood. Elsa's mother and Albert's mother were sisters, making them first cousins. But the genetic closeness was not the strangest aspect of this union. What historians would later find disturbing was a detail buried in the correspondence. Before proposing to Elsa, Albert had considered marrying her daughter instead. Ilse's response, preserved in a letter to a friend, decades later reveals her reveal that Albert had bewilderment. "It is directly hard for me to tell you what I feel," she asking wrote. "Marry the mama or me. No difference, whether he practical married the matter mother or the daughter, as if they were arrangement would be more interchangeable." In the end, Elsa prevailed. She became the second Mrs. Einstein, and Ilse became her stepdaughter, living in the same house as the man who had proposed to her, eating breakfast across from him every morning, navigating a situation that would have driven most families to madness. The marriage to Elsa was comfortable rather than passionate. She understood her role: manage Albert's domestic life, handle his correspondence, protect him from unwanted intrusions, and present a respectable face to the world. She was not expected to understand his physics. She was not expected to challenge his ideas. She was expected to adore him, and she did. "I fell in love with him because he played Mozart so beautifully on the violin," Elsa once told an interviewer. "I have no idea what his theories mean. I don't need to understand them. I understand him." But did anyone? The household that formed after the marriage was peculiar by any standard. Albert, Elsa, and her 2 daughters, Ilse and Margit, lived together in a spacious Berlin apartment. Albert developed warm relationships with both stepdaughters, warmer in some ways than his relationships with his biological sons, who remained in Zurich with Milva. He rarely visited Hans Albert and Eduard. He sent letters, occasionally money, but physical presence was another matter. The train ride to Zurich was not particularly long, but Albert always seemed to have more pressing obligations: a lecture to deliver, a paper to write, a theory to develop. Meanwhile, the affairs continued. Betty Newman was his secretary, young and pretty, hired to help manage his correspondence. Within months, she was managing more than his letters. Elsa knew about it and tolerated it. What choice did she have? Ethel Michanowski was worse. She was Elsa's friend, a wealthy Berlin socialite who moved in the same circles, attended the same parties, drank tea in Elsa's parlor. The betrayal was double: not just adultery, but the violation of friendship, the humiliation of knowing that your husband was sleeping with the woman who smiled at you over cucumber sandwiches. There were others: Toni Mendel, Marguerite Lebach, women who drifted through Albert's life, briefly illuminated by his attention, then discarded. He collected admirers the way other men collected stamps. He charmed them, pursued them, wrote them passionate letters, then moved on. "Marriage is the unsuccessful attempt to make something lasting out of an incident," Albert once said. It revealed something about his fundamental inability to sustain emotional connection. For Albert, every relationship was an incident, a brief flare of intensity followed by cooling, distance, eventual indifference. Yet there were moments of genuine warmth, flashes of humor that made people love him despite his flaws. He refused to wear socks, considering them entirely pointless, a quirk that delighted photographers and baffled formal hosts. He owned a small sailboat called the Tynef, which was Yiddish for garbage, and he was spectacularly bad at sailing it. He capsized regularly, often requiring rescue from passing boats, yet he insisted on taking the vessel out again and again, cheerfully incompetent. When fans approached him on the street, he was patient and kind, signing autographs, answering questions, posing for photographs. When children asked him to explain relativity, he offered his famous analogy. Put your hand on a hot stove for a minute and it seems like an hour. Sit with a pretty girl for an hour and it seems like a minute. That's relativity. There was the story about the train conductor who asked for his ticket. Albert searched his pockets frantically but could not find it. The conductor, recognizing the famous physicist, said, "That's all right, Dr. Einstein. Everyone knows who you are." "Thank you," Albert replied, still searching. "But I need to find that ticket. Otherwise, I don't know where I'm going." He frequently forgot his address. He once called the Princeton University switchboard to ask where he lived. He showed up to formal dinners in sweaters and sandals, his wild hair uncombed, his mind clearly elsewhere. But the absent-mindedness that charmed strangers wounded his family. The man who could not remember his address also could not remember his son's birthdays. The charm that delighted audiences masked a fundamental inability to be present for the people who loved him most. 16 years after his second marriage, another woman entered Albert's life, one who would prove far more dangerous than any of his previous affairs. Margarita Kononkova arrived in Princeton in 1935, 2 years after Albert had fled Nazi Germany. She was the wife of Sergei Kononkova, a Russian sculptor commissioned to create a bust of the famous physicist. Margarita was beautiful, sophisticated, fluent in multiple languages, and extremely attentive to the aging scientist who sat for her husband's artwork. The affair that developed was passionate and prolonged. Albert wrote her love letters that would not be discovered and published until 1998. "I kiss you through the newspaper," he wrote, a reference to photographs of himself that she might see in the press. "Everything here reminds me of you." He was in his mid-60s. She was in her 40s. Elsa had died in 1936, leaving Albert alone in Princeton with only his stepdaughter Margaret for company. He was lonely, seeking comfort, following the pattern that had defined his entire adult life. But Margarita Kononkova was not simply a sculptor's wife seeking excitement with a famous man. She was something far more dangerous. Documents released after the fall of the Soviet Union revealed that Margarita had been an intelligence asset, working under the codename Lucas. Her handlers in Moscow had specifically assigned her to cultivate relationships with influential figures in American science and politics. Albert Einstein, whose letter to President Roosevelt had initiated America's atomic weapons program, was exactly the kind of target Soviet intelligence wanted to penetrate. Did Albert know? Almost certainly not. He was shrewd about physics but naive about people, easily charmed, eager to believe the best about those who showed him affection. He had no idea that the woman he loved was reporting their conversations to Soviet handlers, searching for information about the Manhattan Project that might slip out during intimate moments. The irony was profound. Albert had been the one to warn Roosevelt about the possibility of German atomic weapons. His letter in August of 1939 had set in motion the chain of events that led to the most destructive weapons in history. Yet when the Manhattan Project was actually underway, Albert was deliberately excluded. His political sympathies were considered too leftist, his associations too questionable. The FBI had been watching him for years. J. Edgar Hoover, the paranoid director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had been obsessed with Albert Einstein for decades. The file that Hoover's agents compiled eventually reached 1,400 pages, one of the largest surveillance files ever assembled on an American citizen. They tapped his phone. They opened his mail. They planted informants at his dinner parties. They searched for evidence of communist sympathies, treasonous activities, or anything that might discredit him. They found plenty of material that they considered damning. Albert was openly critical of capitalism and American foreign policy. He supported civil rights at a time when such support was considered radical. He befriended Paul Robeson, the black singer and activist being persecuted for his leftist views. He criticized the House Un-American Activities Committee as worse than what the Nazis had done. Such statements made Hoover apoplectic. Here was the most respected public figure in America openly criticizing the government, associating with suspected communists, expressing views that sounded dangerously un-American. Hoover wanted him deported. Hoover wanted him silenced. He never succeeded. Albert's fame was too great, his scientific achievements too important for any political attack to gain traction. The FBI file grew thicker, but it never produced the evidence Hoover sought. When a reporter asked about the surveillance, Albert shrugged. "Let them watch. I have nothing to hide except my bad violin playing." But he did have things to hide, not political secrets, personal ones, the daughter he had never acknowledged, the wife he had driven away, the sons he had abandoned, the women he had used and discarded, the contradiction between his public image as a humanitarian and his private behavior as a deeply flawed human being. Elsa died in December of 1936 of heart and kidney disease after several years of declining health. Her final months were spent largely bedridden, watching her husband retreat into his work, unable to face her suffering. "I have gotten used to loneliness," Albert wrote after her death. It was a strange thing to say about the loss of a wife, not grief, not sorrow, but merely adaptation. He had gotten used to being alone. He had always been alone, even when surrounded by people who loved him. The relationship with Margarita ended when she returned to the Soviet Union in 1945, shortly after the war ended. Albert wrote her longing letters for months afterward, letters surely read by Soviet intelligence officers before being filed away in Moscow archives. He never saw her again. He probably never learned the truth about who she really was. But two people refused to accept their secondary status in Albert Einstein's life. Two people demanded more than he was willing to give. They were his sons, and their stories would become the greatest tragedy of his existence. Hans Albert Einstein grew up with a famous father he rarely saw. The boy who had stood on the Berlin train platform in 1914, watching his parents' marriage disintegrate, became a young man who viewed his father with a mixture of admiration and resentment. He studied engineering at ETH Zurich, the same institution where his parents had met, deliberately choosing a field different from physics, as if to carve out space that his father had not already occupied. He was talented in his own right. He specialized in hydraulic engineering, studying the movement of sediment in rivers, developing theories that would make him respected in his field. But no matter what he accomplished, he could not escape his father's shadow. Every introduction began with the same words. "This is Hans Albert Einstein, son of the famous physicist." Every achievement was measured against the impossible standard of relativity and E equals mc squared. The relationship between father and son was marked by periods of connection and longer periods of estrangement. They wrote letters. They occasionally visited. They discussed science and politics and family matters. But there was always a distance between them, a coldness that neither could overcome. The breaking point came in 1927, when Hans Albert fell in love with a woman named Frieda Knecht. She was older than him, considered by some to be plain, not from a prestigious family. Albert disapproved intensely, and in his disapproval he became his own mother, repeating the exact pattern that had caused him such pain decades earlier. "She is not right for you," Albert told his son. "You can do better." The words echoed across the generations. Paul and Einstein had said the same thing about Milva. Now Albert was saying it about Frieda. The son who had defied his parents' wishes, who had married against their opposition, who had suffered their rejection for years, this same son was now rejecting his own child's choice. Hans Albert married Frieda anyway. For years afterward, the relationship between father and son was strained to the breaking point. They exchanged terse letters. They avoided visits. The grandchildren that Frieda bore, Albert's own grandchildren, grew up barely knowing their famous grandfather. He was always somewhere else, Hans Albert would say later. Even when he was in the room, his mind was elsewhere. I learned early that there was no space for us in his thoughts. Eventually, there was a reconciliation of sorts. Hans Albert became a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, achieving the academic success that had eluded his mother. He visited Princeton occasionally. He introduced his children to their grandfather. But the warmth that should exist between father and son was never fully kindled. Too much damage had been done. Too many years had been lost. If Hans Albert's story was one of survival, his brother Eduard's story was one of destruction. The younger son, born in 1910, inherited his father's intelligence but not his emotional armor. Eduard was sensitive, artistic, deeply feeling. He wrote poetry. He played piano beautifully. He dreamed of becoming a psychiatrist, of understanding the human mind the way his father understood the physical universe. As a young man, Eduard worshipped his father. He read everything Albert wrote. He memorized passages from his letters. He longed for approval, for attention, for some sign that the most famous man in the world noticed his existence. His letters to Albert were filled with questions, observations, desperate attempts to engage the great mind in conversation. The responses he received were brief, formal, intellectually engaged but emotionally distant. Albert discussed physics with his son. He discussed philosophy. He did not discuss feelings. He did not offer the warmth that Eduard craved. In his early 20s, Eduard began to show signs of mental illness. The diagnosis was schizophrenia, a devastating condition poorly understood at the time and even more poorly treated. Eduard experienced delusions, paranoid episodes, periods of complete disconnection from reality. He was hospitalized at the Burgersley Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich, one of the most respected institutions of its kind in Europe. The treatments he received were the standard therapies of the era: insulin shock therapy, which induced comas through massive doses of insulin, sedatives, isolation. These treatments were considered progressive at the time. By modern standards, they were barbaric. Eduard suffered through them with only his mother Milva to advocate for his care. Albert, by this time, had emigrated to America. The year was 1933. The Nazis had come to power in Germany. Albert's property had been seized. His books had been burned. A bounty had been placed on his head. He fled to Princeton and never returned to Europe. He also never returned to see Eduard. For 22 years, from 1933 until his death in 1955, Albert Einstein lived an ocean away from his younger son, who spent those decades in and out of psychiatric institutions, suffering from a disease that slowly consumed his mind. Albert sent money. He sent occasional letters, but he did not visit. He did not make the journey across the Atlantic to see the child who had once idolized him. Why? The question haunts biographers. Some suggest that Albert believed mental illness was hereditary, that he blamed Milva's family for Eduard's condition. Others argue that he simply could not face the suffering, that the sight of his son reduced to a shell was more than he could bear. Still others suggest that Eduard had become an inconvenience, a problem that could not be solved with equations, a reminder of failure in a life devoted to success. Eduard's letters from this period are heartbreaking. "Sometimes I wonder if you think of me at all," he wrote to his father, "or if I am just another problem you have solved by ignoring." Albert's responses, when they came, were measured and careful, offering intellectual engagement, but never the emotional connection Eduard needed. Milva devoted herself to Eduard's care. She spent the Nobel Prize money, depleted her savings, sacrificed her own health to ensure that her son received the best treatment available. She visited him regularly at the Burgersley. She provided the parental presence that Albert could not, or would not, offer. She died in August of 1948, alone in Zurich, her body worn out by decades of struggle. The woman who had once been Albert Einstein's intellectual equal, who had studied physics at the highest levels, ended her life forgotten and obscure, mourned only by her sons and a few loyal friends. Eduard outlived both his parents. He remained at the Burgosli until his death in 1965, a decade after Albert passed away. He never understood why the most famous man in the world could not find time to visit him. "I am a horse for single harness," Albert had written decades earlier, explaining why he was unsuited for close relationships. "I have never fully belonged to my country, my home, my friends, or even my immediate family." The wish to withdraw. This was the defining characteristic of Albert Einstein's emotional life. Not cruelty exactly, not indifference, simply an overwhelming need to be alone, to exist inside his own mind, to keep the world at a distance where it could not make demands on him. There is a strange footnote to his later years that captures something essential about his character. Someone gave him a parrot named Bibo, reportedly because they thought the famous physicist needed companionship. The bird was depressed, refusing to sing or speak. Albert, concerned, began telling it dirty jokes, hoping to cheer it up. The image is absurd and somehow touching. One of history's greatest minds trying to comfort a melancholy bird with off-color humor. He could not comfort his son, but he tried to comfort a parrot. There is also a story, possibly embellished, about Albert and his chauffeur. The driver had accompanied Albert to so many lectures that he had memorized the entire speech. One day, as a joke, they switched roles. The chauffeur delivered the lecture while Albert sat in the audience, disguised in the driver's uniform. The deception worked perfectly until a professor asked a complicated technical question. The chauffeur, unfazed, replied, "That question is so simple. I let my chauffeur answer it." And Albert, from the back of the room, provided the response. Whether or not the story is true, it captures the playfulness that coexisted with his emotional limitations, the humor that softened the edges, the humanity that flickered beneath the surface of myth. But there was one more burden he would carry, one that weighed more heavily than any family failure. On August 2nd, 1939, a humid summer day on Long Island, a black automobile pulled up to a cottage where Albert was spending his vacation. The driver was a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard, and he had come with a warning that would change the course of human history. Szilard and Albert had collaborated years earlier on an unlikely invention, a refrigerator. In 1926, a Berlin newspaper had reported a tragic story, an entire family killed by toxic fumes leaking from their refrigerator's mechanical seal. The incident had disturbed both scientists. They spent months designing an absorption refrigerator with no moving parts, no seals that could fail. They patented the design. It was never commercially produced, but it revealed something important. Both men cared about practical consequences, about the human cost of scientific progress. Now Szilard had come to discuss a different kind of technology, one with consequences far beyond a single family. German scientists had recently achieved nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium atoms. The implications were staggering. If a chain reaction could be sustained, the energy released would be enormous, enough to level cities, enough to end wars, enough to end civilization itself. Szilard believed the Germans were already working on such a weapon. He believed the Nazis, if they developed it first, would use it without hesitation. He believed the only hope was for America to develop the weapon before Germany did. And he believed that only one person had enough prestige to convince President Franklin Roosevelt to take action. The two men sat on the cottage porch discussing physics and politics and the fate of the world. Albert listened carefully. He had not been following the latest developments in nuclear research. His own work had moved in different directions. But he understood immediately what Szilard was describing. He understood the mathematics. He understood the danger. "I never thought of that," Albert said quietly, when Szilard explained the possibility of a chain reaction. It was a remarkable admission from the man who had discovered E equals mc squared, the equation that made nuclear weapons theoretically possible. He had unlocked the door. He had not imagined what might walk through it. Szilard had brought a draft letter addressed to President Roosevelt. It warned of the German threat. It urged the American government to begin its own research into atomic weapons. It requested funding, resources, urgency. All it needed was a signature. Albert read the letter carefully. He suggested some changes. Then he signed it. 1 month later, Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. 2 years later, the United States established the Manhattan Project. 4 years after that, on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a plutonium bomb fell on Nagasaki. The combined death toll exceeded 200,000 people. Albert learned about Hiroshima from a radio news report. His secretary, Helen Dukas, heard the announcement first and rushed to tell him. The physicist who had unlocked the secrets of matter and energy sat in silence as the broadcaster described the devastation. Then he spoke. "Oh my God!" The equation that bore his name had been transformed from an abstraction into a mushroom cloud. The theoretical had become horrifyingly real. In the days that followed, reporters besieged him seeking comment. Was he proud of his contribution? Did he feel responsible? Would he sign the letter again? His answers evolved over time, but one statement became definitive. "I made one great mistake in my life," he told a colleague, "when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made." A mistake. The word seems inadequate for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, but Albert was careful in his choice of language. He did not say he regretted warning Roosevelt about the German threat. What he regretted was the specific recommendation that America should build the bombs, not merely research them. A reporter challenged him, "But you didn't build the bomb yourself." "No," Albert replied, "I only opened the door." The irony cut deep. Albert had been deliberately excluded from the Manhattan Project. Despite his letter to Roosevelt, despite his prestige, the military authorities considered him a security risk. His leftist politics, his associations with suspected radicals, all of this made him suspect. So the man whose equation made the bomb possible, whose letter initiated the project, was kept outside the fence while others did the actual work. The years that followed Hiroshima were marked by guilt and activism. Albert threw himself into efforts to control nuclear weapons. He joined the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists. He spoke out against the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, he wrote in 1946, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. He advocated for world government, a single global authority with the power to prevent war. He knew it was utopian. He knew the political obstacles were insurmountable, but he refused to remain silent simply because the solution seemed impossible. In 1952, the State of Israel offered Albert the presidency. David Ben-Gurion sent a formal invitation asking him to become the ceremonial head of state. It was an extraordinary honor, recognition of his status as the most famous Jew in the world. Albert declined. "I am deeply moved by the offer," he wrote, "but I am not suited for the position. All my life I have dealt with objective matters, and I lack both the natural aptitude and the experience to deal properly with people." It was characteristically honest. The man who understood the universe could not understand people. He knew his limitations, even if he could not overcome them. In April of 1955, just days before his death, Albert signed one final political document, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, co-authored with the philosopher Bertrand Russell. It called for the abolition of nuclear weapons and the peaceful resolution of international conflicts. "We appeal as human beings to human beings," the manifesto declared. "Remember your humanity and forget the rest." It was released posthumously in July. By then, Albert Einstein was gone. The final years were quiet. Albert lived in a modest house on Mercer Street in Princeton, a white clapboard building that became a pilgrimage site for admirers from around the world. He walked to his office at the Institute for Advanced Study, often forgetting his socks, his white hair wild and uncombed, his mind still wrestling with the problems that had consumed him for decades. The unified field theory remained elusive. Albert spent the last 30 years of his life searching for a single mathematical framework that would unite gravity with electromagnetism, that would reveal the fundamental unity underlying all physical phenomena. He never found it. The younger generation of physicists had moved on to quantum mechanics, to a probabilistic understanding of reality that Albert found philosophically disturbing. God does not play dice with the universe, he famously declared, rejecting the randomness at the heart of quantum theory. He was wrong, as it turned out. The quantum mechanical description of reality has proven extraordinarily successful, while the unified field theory that Albert sought remains undiscovered. But being wrong did not diminish his stature. Even his failures were magnificent, the failures of a mind reaching for ultimate truth, unwilling to settle for partial answers. His companion during these final years was Johanna Fantova, a librarian at Princeton University who was decades younger than him. Their relationship was one of intellectual friendship and deep affection. Johanna kept a diary of their conversations, the most intimate record we have of Albert's final thoughts. He said today that he feels like a man who has spent his whole life trying to read a book in a language he doesn't quite understand. She recorded in 1954. It was a poignant admission from someone who had understood more about the universe than any human being before him. Even at the end, he felt the limits of his comprehension. In the autumn of that year, 6 months before his death, Albert spoke with unusual candor to Johanna about his regrets. "I have lived a long time," he told her, the autumn light falling through the windows onto stacks of papers covered with equations. "And I have learned some things, but the most important things, how to be a good father, how to love without hurting, these I never learned. These I failed." It was a rare admission from a man who had spent his life projecting confidence. The physicist who had overturned centuries of scientific understanding now confessed that he had failed at the most basic human tasks. "Milva deserved better," he continued. "She was talented, truly talented, and I took that from her. I took her career. I took her confidence. I left her with nothing but the children, and then I took myself away from them too." He paused, staring at the equations on his desk. "Eduard writes to me still, from the hospital. He asks why I don't visit. He asks what he did wrong. How do I answer that? He did nothing wrong. He was born with a sensitive soul into a family that could not nurture it. He needed a father who was present, and instead he got a father who was famous. Fame is a poor substitute for love." He thought often of Lieserl in these final months, the daughter he had never seen, the child who had vanished into history. "I wonder sometimes what she looked like," he told Johanna. "Did she have Milva's eyes? Was she musical? I will never know. I chose not to know. I chose my career over my child, and now I have the career but not the child, and I am not sure the exchange was worth it." There were lighter moments too. The stream of letters from admirers, cranks, students, fellow scientists, all answered with patience by Helen Dukas, his loyal secretary. The walks through Princeton that became legendary. The violin playing that he loved despite his mediocre skill. He remained curious until the end. He remained engaged with the world, with politics, with science, with the great questions that had defined his life. The aneurysm had been growing for years. Albert knew about it. His doctors had detected the bulge in his abdominal aorta during an examination in 1948. They had recommended surgery. He had refused, preferring to live with the knowledge that death could come at any moment. "I want to go when I want," he told them. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially." On April 13, 1955, a Wednesday, the aneurysm ruptured. Albert collapsed at his home on Mercer Street. An ambulance rushed him to Princeton Hospital, where doctors again urged surgery. Again, he refused. "I have done my share," he told them. "It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." Elegantly. Even in dying, he was thinking about control, about doing things on his own terms. Margaret, his stepdaughter, stayed by his bedside. Helen Dukas came and went, managing the flood of inquiries from press and public. Hans Albert flew in from California, arriving just in time to say goodbye to the father who had always been more absent than presence. What passed between father and son in those final hours is not recorded. Did they reconcile? Did they speak of the past, the divorce, the conflict over Hans Albert's marriage, the years of distance? Did Albert apologize? Did Hans Albert forgive? We know only that they were together, that Hans Albert sat by his father's bedside as the life ebbed away, that whatever words were spoken marked the end of a relationship that had begun on a Berlin train platform 40 years earlier. On the night of April 17th, Albert asked for his notepad. He wanted to work. Even now, even with death approaching, the equations called to him, the unified field theory, the problem he had been trying to solve for 3 decades, the answer that remained just out of reach. He wrote for several hours. The handwriting grew shakier as the night progressed, but he kept working, driven by whatever force had always driven him: curiosity, obsession, the refusal to surrender to ignorance. Around midnight, exhaustion overtook him. He set down the notepad. He closed his eyes. At 1:15 in the morning on April 18, 1955, Albert Einstein spoke his final words. He spoke them in German, his native language. He spoke them to the night nurse who was monitoring his condition. She did not understand German. She heard sounds she could not interpret, and then watched him fall silent forever. The last words of Albert Einstein were lost. The final communication of one of history's greatest minds vanished into the darkness of a hospital room, heard but not understood, spoken but never recorded. He was pronounced dead at 1:15 a.m. He was 76 years old. The cause of death was rupture of an aortic aneurysm. The news spread rapidly. Radio stations interrupted their programs. Newspapers prepared special editions. Within hours, the world knew that Albert Einstein was dead. Messages of condolence poured in from presidents and prime ministers, from scientists and artists, from ordinary people who had never understood his theories, but had sensed that he represented something important about human potential. The funeral was simple and private, as Albert had requested. Only 12 people attended. There was no religious service. Albert had been a lifelong agnostic, believing in what he called Spinoza's God, the impersonal deity manifest in the laws of nature. His body was cremated. The ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location to prevent the establishment of a shrine. But the brain was already gone. Thomas Harvey, the pathologist who performed the autopsy, had removed it without authorization. By the time the family discovered what had happened, Harvey had photographed the brain, measured it, and sliced it into 240 pieces. He claimed it was for scientific research. He claimed he would find the secret of genius encoded in the tissue. The family was appalled. Otto Nathan, the executor of Albert's estate, demanded the brain's return. Harvey refused. He kept it for decades, stored in jars, transported when he moved, shown to visitors who asked, gradually dispersed to researchers who promised serious study. The studies that resulted were inconclusive. Scientists found unusual features in certain regions. The parietal lobes were larger than average. But the brain is not the mind. The tissue in Harvey's jars could not explain how Albert Einstein had seen what no one else could see. It could not explain creativity, stubbornness, courage, or emotional limitation. The brain was just tissue. The genius had departed. Decades passed. The principles in Albert Einstein's story died, one by one. Milva had preceded him by 7 years, dying alone in Zurich in 1948. The Nobel Prize money that was supposed to secure her future had been depleted by Eduard's medical care. She ended her life impoverished, her contributions still debated. Eduard followed in 1965, still confined to the Burgosli, still waiting for a father who would never come. He was 55 years old. Hans Albert died in 1973, a respected scientist in his own right, but forever marked by his relationship to a famous father. He was not cruel, Hans Albert said in one of his final interviews. He was simply absent. There is a difference. Cruelty requires attention. Absence requires nothing. Margit Einstein lived until 1986. Her death closed a chapter, ended an era. The people who had actually known Albert Einstein, who had eaten breakfast with him and heard his violin, were gone. But the legend continued to grow. Books were written. Documentaries were filmed. His face appeared on posters and T-shirts around the world. The wild white hair, the kind eyes, the impish smile, these became symbols of intellectual achievement itself. In 1999, Time magazine named Albert Einstein the person of the century. The honor recognized his scientific achievements, his cultural impact, his transformation of human understanding. The article did not mention Lieserl. This is how legends are made, by selection, by omission, by choosing which truths to tell and which to leave in darkness. But the darkness does not disappear simply because we refuse to look at it. Albert Einstein was extraordinary. He was also deeply flawed. Both of these things are true. Both matter. The search for Lieserl continues to this day. Researchers have spent decades combing through Serbian archives, following leads that inevitably fade into uncertainty. The most compelling theory suggests that she died from scarlet fever in late 1903 when she was approximately 18 months old. But other possibilities remain. She may have been adopted. She may have survived under a different name. She may have had descendants who are alive today, unaware of their connection to history. We may never know. The records that would prove or disprove these theories have been lost to time. Lieserl Einstein remains a ghost, a question mark at the heart of her father's biography. What does it mean to remember Albert Einstein now? He was a towering intellect, the greatest scientific mind of the modern era. His theories reshaped our understanding of reality, revealing truths hidden since the beginning of time. He showed us that space curves, that time dilates, that matter and energy are interchangeable. He opened doors we are still walking through. He was also a distant father, a cruel husband, a man who could see across the cosmos but could not see across the dinner table. He abandoned a daughter. He drove away a wife. He neglected his sons. He broke the hearts of women who loved him. Can we separate the achievement from the man? Should we? The most honest response is to acknowledge both, to celebrate the theories while mourning the failures, to admire the courage that challenged established physics while recognizing the cowardice that fled from emotional responsibility, to see Albert Einstein whole, not as a saint, not as a monster, but as a human being who achieved extraordinary things and caused extraordinary pain. He gave us new eyes to see the universe. He also showed us how brilliance in one domain does not guarantee wisdom in another. He proved that the most important questions, how to love, how to be present, how to care for those who depend on us, cannot be solved with equations. The house on Mercer Street still stands. The Institute for Advanced Study still operates. The equations he wrote are still taught in universities around the world. His name has become synonymous with intelligence itself. But somewhere, in a forgotten corner of Serbia, there may be a grave without a headstone, or a family that does not know its history, or a story that has been buried beneath the weight of fame. Lieserl, the daughter who vanished, the mystery that remains. Albert Einstein saw further into reality than any human being before him. He reshaped our understanding of existence itself. He gave humanity E equals mx squared and the bending of starlight and the curvature of spacetime. But when he looked inward, at the daughter he never held, the sons he could not reach, the women he could not love faithfully, he saw only questions without answers. Some problems have no solutions. Some choices cannot be undone. Some doors once closed stay closed forever. He died alone, speaking words that no one understood, reaching for answers that remained just beyond his grasp. He was the most famous human being on Earth. He was also, in the ways that matter most, incomplete. The universe keeps its secrets, and so in the end did Albert Einstein.